Hello everyone, welcome back to the True North Report, news that every Canadian needs to know. So I don't really have a plan for today, I just decided to come out here and I'd riff a little bit. As you'll notice, my avatar right now had a special addition to it, the yellow vest. Mine is definitely, you can have Flatel is represented to the yellow vest movement that's here in Canada, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the yellow vest that's going on in France, because I believe that this is beginning of a catalyst of change, not just in France, but around the world. Well, we've seen already how the Yellow Vest movement has been picking up steam in other countries, especially other countries in Europe, such as Belgium has been a big one. But there's been a lot of misinformation that's going on out there about what is the purpose of the Yellow Vest movement. The Yellow Vest movement, despite the fact what we hear a lot in the media about how it has to do with the French people that are rioting over a diesel tax, the problems go actually much deeper than that. And if you've been paying attention to what's going on in Europe and what's going on in France over the last few years, it all begins to make sense. A much clearer picture comes in. See, ever since the 2015 migrant crisis, the people of France have watched as their country and their culture has begun to transform. Since they've had these large swaths of immigrants coming in, they've had problems such as an increase in violent crime, an increase in sexual assaults and rapes, an increase in terror attacks. And this all has to do with the policies that have been put out by the French government right now. And right now that government for the last 18 months or so has been Emmanuel Macron as the president of France. So when they talk about this diesel tax and they say that this is the reason that the French people are protesting, what they're not telling you is this was just the final straw for the French people. When you look at the rise in terrorist attacks, when you look at how their culture is being changed and the amount of people that they've had come into their country over the last few years, as well as the policies that have been put out over the last few years, because the French election was very similar in ways to what ended up happening in America, more that their election ended up reaching international news. It became international headlines all over the place that were reporting on the battle between Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron. And they presented Marine Le Pen as some sort of far-right radical who needed to be stopped at all costs. And it was a close election, but in the end, Emmanuel Macron ended up winning it. Now, since then, he is painted himself as supposed to be a left-wing politician, but he has betrayed a lot of what he has talked about, very similar to what we see that has happened with Justin Trudeau here in Canada. Emmanuel Macron has, since he came into power, he's been giving tax cuts to the rich elite, and then he's been passing those spending costs over to the middle class and lower class people of France. So he's taxing them more, he's giving the wealthy a cut, and then he's also at the same time, he's a globalist and is one of the main globalist leaders that we see in the world today, very similar to Angela Merkel and Justin Trudeau here in Canada. And the thing is about the globalist leaders is they never ever actually represent the people that they're supposed to, despite the fact this is what they try and present themselves as. But someone like Marine Le Pen was a populist leader. Donald Trump ran on a populist campaign. And this is something that even recently we've watched, is Justin Trudeau has tried to tear down, that populism is something to be scared of. Populism is something that needs to be avoided at all costs. When the idea of populism is just a government, the politicians that are actually listening to what the people want and trying to enact change for what the people want. This is what the idea of it is. It doesn't sound like a very radical idea. In fact, this is exactly what the whole idea of democracy was founded upon. It was founded upon the idea that the individual has their voice represented in government. But lately, this is not what's been going on. So this is why the people of France have been protesting and why the Yellow Vest movement has picked up all over the world. Because even though they're just saying it's the diesel tax, it's everything. The people who are leading the Yellow Vests, they have met with government officials, which was not a popular move amongst the other Yellow Vests, actually. But I don't see why it would not be, because you can't enact the change without meeting with government representatives in order to pass along that message and get legislation put in place in order to enact the changes that you're looking for. But they met up with these government representatives, and in there, sure, they did bring up the diesel tax, which is, of course, the French version of the carbon tax that we face here in Canada. But there was more to their demands than just the diesel tax. In fact, the diesel tax was just sort of something off to the side. And what they were really talking about was returning the power to the people. That for so long, the French people have felt treaded on by their government that now they're starting to revolt once again. And this is not a new phenomenon when it comes to France. There's been a number of revolutions in France, a number of uprisings, and this actually has even taken place since the French Revolution from a few hundred years ago. And we can even hear when sometimes some people are actually reporting on what the French people really want. And I've just pulled up a brief video of that for you right now.
The French are on the streets because they want to live in dignity, that is, to be able to raise their children without state assistance, without being constantly subsidised, and that's the Yellow Vest movement.
This week, though, the crowd...
So that was actually taken very recently. That was something that was taken up just a few days ago because the Yellow Vest movement has moved into its fifth week now, I believe. It began in about mid-November. So that was only a taste of what the Yellow Vests want. But this is spread everywhere. This is spread everywhere, I should say. The Yellow Vest movement has even found its way into places such as Belgium. The Yellow Vest movement has seen them protesting outside of the European Union because the European Union has been, just like the UN that we're seeing today, they are trying to override the sovereignty of a nation. They are trying to institute, in this case, when we're talking about the EU, a continental government. And when you have a continental government, you can't represent the people. It's just impossible. The demographics are too large. The population is too large in order to represent everyone. As we look into countries, even we can take examples from here in Canada, we see how just all over, whether you're in the Maritimes or you're in more of Quebec and Ontario, the more centralized provinces, or you're looking more towards the west, your interests are different. Now, you have people in Europe who have different languages, different cultures. They can't all be represented in the European Union. And this is something that we've seen, that representatives inside of the European Union, members of European Parliament, have full out said that some sovereignty has to be signed over to the EU by these European nations. And that's something that never sits well with the actual people themselves. Maybe it sits well with the governments. But in these continental governments, in these world governments, whether that's the EU talking about the continental government or it's the UN talking about a world government, the representatives of the individual countries is recognized, but not the interests of the people. The Canadian people's interests don't get recognized. The American people's interests don't get recognized. The Spanish people's interests don't get recognized. And this is one of the main problems that we're having right now. And this is why the Yellow Vest movement has been born, and it's spreading all over the world. And this has come to Canada too. Over the last few weeks, we've been seeing how the Yellow Vest movement has reached Canada, and there are people out there protesting. I believe even just this past weekend, I'm filming this early Monday morning, so I believe that we are seeing this happen even in, there was a protest over Canada this weekend. I could be wrong on that, but we really saw it take effect in the protests that ended up happening a week or two ago all over Canada when it was against the Global Compact for Migration. And the reason for that is because the people are done. The people have watched for so long as they've been ignored by their politicians, and even the politicians that say that they work for you don't actually work for you. It's just a talking point that they like to bring out. Someone like Michelle Rempel who says, fighting hard in Ottawa for you. That's something she signs off pretty much every single video she ever does with. But she's not fighting for you. Sure, she might represent some small interests, such as when she talks about some immigration, since she's the immigration critic of the shadow cabinet. But all in all, she's working for her own self-interest, and she's working for her party's self-interest. But we need something completely different. A candidate that is truly about the people and not about self-interest. And this is why sometimes it's hard to pin down someone like Maxime Bernier. Is Maxime Bernier actually trying to run on a populist platform for legitimate purposes for the people because he sees the problems that we're talking about and he wants to enact change for us? Or is he doing it for his own self-interest? Is he so fed up with the CPC, the Conservative Party of Canada, that he decides, fuck it, I'm going to go out and make my own party? It's hard to nail that down. But this is the problem when you have politicians that don't listen to you, don't respect you, and are only in it for their own self-interest. And if you'll just give me 1 second. I just wanted to show my solidarity with the yellow vest, but now I'm going back to the classic. I like the leather jacket on my guy. So, like I said, I don't really have certain topics that I'm in mind, but really what's been bugging me over the last little bit is this idea of warming up to the UN even more. And this is something that I do like about Maxime Bernier's platform, is that under him, he would pull out of the Canada out of the United Nations, or at the very least, significantly limit the amount of participation and money that goes from Canada into the UN. The UN is a crock of shit. Just give me 1 sec. I gotta have a quick sip of my drink. The UN is a crock of shit. It began with good intentions. It began as a League of Nations after, I believe it was World War I. The League of Nations was its precursor to the United Nations, and it was because after the First World War, and especially after the Second World War, we saw devastation on a scale that the world had never seen before. The World War I was one thing. We saw mass casualties, but all in all, it was most of Europe was actually unaffected directly by this, as in their cities weren't affected, the populations weren't affected, aside from the people that were going in and doing the fighting, and those who lost people during the war. But World War II changed that, because World War II, the fighting literally took place all over Europe. Countless cities were destroyed. There were millions upon millions of refugees who were fleeing the Nazis. And you know what? It may not just be the Nazis, but they may have been fleeing the Allies too. They just wanted to get away from the war as they watched as their homes and their families were ripped apart by this continental war. So the idea behind the United Nations was to prevent these sort of conflicts from happening again. Bring the world together, bring all these countries together to try and talk and figure out our problems. Work together because we're people. That was more or less the idea behind it. But very quickly, corruption set into the UN, as with just about any government out there, and the UN started being less about actually world cooperation and more about the power of the people who sit on the UN, the power towards the UN itself. And this is what we're seeing today. We're seeing the manifestation of all that corruption come to light. And they do this by by the policies that they implement, these agreements, these global agreements that everyone has to participate and everyone has to go along with. A couple examples of this is what we saw with the Global Compact for Migration, but also the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Climate Agreement was actually started mostly by a man known as Maurice Strong. Maurice Strong is one of those guys that just pops up everywhere. No matter where you look, no matter where you are, and you will find him. He's been all over the world. He's actually originally from Quebec, but then he's disappeared. Popped up in China, and this was during the time of the Cold War. Him and his cousin had a lot of pull with the Chinese government, which seems a little bit interesting, considering how at the time Canada and China were not necessarily on the best of terms. China and the West were not on the best of terms. They were a communist government going up against a capitalist government, because this was the point of the Cold War. It was not a war. It was a fight for influence. Communism versus capitalism. But this man, and his cousin especially, they had a lot of pull with the Chinese government. And then they made their way into the UN. And they sat and became a big part of when it came to the environmental policies that are pushed by the UN. And something like the Paris Climate Agreement, it doesn't address the real problems of climate change. See, whether it's not a question of if climate change is real, because the problems that we're seeing today are problems of climate change, but a carbon tax isn't going to fix those. What the problem that we're seeing when it comes to climate change is more to do with the amount of water that is being contaminated, how there is less land that is fertile for agriculture these days. As we see the expansion of cities all over the world, it's much more difficult in order for people to get the resources that they need in order to survive. A carbon price isn't going to change that. Really, what the world needs is not so much a price on carbon. What they need is to clean up their environments. If you clean up your environments, most of the problems that come with climate change that they're talking about would actually disappear. But there are certain things that they like to present to us that are not true. They like to present to us that now we have things such as forest fires and storms that are worse than they've ever been, when in a lot of ways it's actually the opposite. In a lot of ways, we're seeing how storms don't have quite the power that they used to, and there's actually less forest fires these days than there were in the past. And they don't acknowledge certain things that come with, let's for instance, there was a couple months ago, there was the forest fire that was in California, and everyone was chalking that up to climate change. But people were warning that even back at the beginning, about January of 2018, people were warning that there was a lot of dead trees that were around there. There was a lot of dry trees that could possibly lead to a forest fire. With the smallest outbreak could definitely expand into a giant forest fire, and this is exactly what happened. So the point of the Paris Climate Agreement is it brings control of both natural resources, but also money. That's also a big one. It brings control of natural resources, money, and some sovereignty of the nations into the control of the UN, more specifically the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. See, what the Paris Climate Agreement does is, as it works right now, the businesses pollute while they're making products for the people, and then that's it, right? And then their pollution creates carbon dioxide, which then goes into the atmosphere, causes climate change. That's using the method that we use now. What the Paris Climate Agreement does is it puts a price on the pollution now. So an industry, a country, nothing changes in the way that they operate. The businesses still produce product that the people buy. They still pollute with their carbon dioxide. But now they've got to pay the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. They've got to pay them, and in exchange, this group will issue carbon credits to them, allowing them to pollute. So you get one credit for, just as an example, every 100 tons of carbon that you produce. So how much money you give to the UN and how many credits they issue you is how much you can pollute. But these credits, the way it works as well, means we'll actually give more of a pass to industry in order to pollute more. So how does that actually help the climate change argument? It doesn't. But all it does is it controls the industries themselves. It controls the oil that is produced inside of that country and how it makes its way to the world market, and it brings a profit for the IPCC and the UN. To me, I always found it a little interesting the timing of their latest report, because it was just a couple months ago. I think it was in October. It was just in October where they put out this new report that was saying that that we need to manage our the climate change, the temperature change. We need to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or by the year 2030, the world is going to be too far gone, and pretty much it'll mean the eradication of human life. But what I always found was interesting about this was the timing of it, because we saw that in about December of 2017, President Trump announced that he was thinking about reducing funding to the UN, and he ended up doing this sometime in January. And then he ended up doing it a few months later as well. He cut more funding to the UN. And it was around this time that the UN also started telling the other member states to pay up. You got to make sure you're paying your dues, or you're going to face some repercussions. And around the same time, we found out that the UN is going broke. And then this report comes out that says that, well, we're almost on the verge of killing ourselves because of climate change, human-caused climate change, and you need to do stuff now in order to change things around. And one of the main things that they recommended was a carbon tax. So if they're running out of money, and then they're encouraging those nations to input a carbon price on them, and then in exchange, that money that is being collected by the carbon tax is then used to go towards the UN, then it seems clear to me that this is just a con because the UN is running out of money. That because Donald Trump and America, one of the biggest payees towards the UN, are starting to pull their funding, that now they need to find another way in order to get money from the people. Taking your money and mine, in order to pay for the UN, an organization that the average citizen of any nation doesn't want, doesn't need. Please excuse me, I need another drink. So this is where we're at in the world these days. But the UN is also used for more than that. And actually, before I get into that, let's talk a little bit about this global compact for migration. Because as we see through the Paris climate agreements, it's getting in the way of how you engage in business. It's getting in the way of, if you are an oil-producing nation such as Canada, it gets in the way of you being able to do so, which would turn a huge profit for Canada. We're losing something like $100 million a day in our oil industry just being so pushed back, or it being having the activists going against it. We're down to something like $20 per barrel of oil. But now we turn to the Global Compact for Migration. Now, the Global Compact for Migration is a global agreement in order to try and mainstream the immigration process and bring them more protection. Or at least that's what they're telling us. That's what their propaganda that they end up putting out. But is that the actual reason behind it? When I look into it and the things that they say, this doesn't seem to be the way for me. This doesn't seem to make sense to me that this is actually what they're doing. There's something out there called mass migration warfare. And as it more or less says, the idea of it is to move a large group of people from one culture into the country of another. And when that happens, just like we're seeing in Europe over the last couple of years, when that happens, you have large social strife, one group pitted against the next. And I believe this is the point of the Global Compact for Migration. As we see, the one thing about these globalists is they want as much power as possible. Despite the fact they try and present themselves as doing what's right for the people, doing what's right for the world, their main goal is power. And it really always has been. It is for most politicians. But now they're trying to drive that on a global scale. They're not just trying to gain power in their own country. They're trying to gain power all over the world. And the Global Compact for Migration does this. It's actually shocking some of the rights that it would undermine. I mean, we talk, let's say, for instance, the freedom of the press. Because Article 17 of the Global Compact for Migration talks about defunding defunding any news outlet that doesn't speak favorably of migration. That they pretty much saying, as I say, that pushes xenophobia, racism, all the buzzwords. But pretty much, if you read between the lines, it's telling you any news outlet that is anti-immigration is going to then face funding cuts. And it could even go even farther than that. It could even go down to being criminally charged because of it. But then at the very end of that, they talk about doing all this while still staying true to the freedom of the press. You can't have it both ways. And to me, it seems very clear that the freedom of the press isn't very high on their priority list. The freedom of the press is something that they'd actually probably like to undermine. And if you look at what Trudeau's done recently, we can see how he's undermining the freedom of the press. In the 2018 federal budget, they were talking about giving bailouts to local news sources. Now, the problem with that is that a lot of people get their news from their local sources, not so much from the national sources such as CBC, CTV, Global, National Post, Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, not these sources, but they get it from their own small local paper, which are already being bought up by big corporations right now, whether that's Post Media, or that's Bell, or that's Rogers. They're being bought up as it is, but by bailing them out, because they're talking about how print journalism is facing a big problem right now, which I don't deny that it is. But when you receive that money from the government, and especially if that's the money you're relying on to stay open, you're probably more reluctant to begin with to try and speak out against the government because you're the one giving you money. And if ever it came down to it where the government threatened to pull that funding, well, then that'll shut you up pretty damn quickly. But now, even more recently, they've announced that they're giving a $600 million payout to certain media companies because of it. And since then, it seems like the media has gotten even worse. There was an interview done between Rosemary Barton from the CBC and Justin Trudeau just a week or two ago. And in that interview, she gave him such softball questions, such as, what is your favorite music? Do you listen to podcasts when you run? And things such as this bullshit, like complete bullshit questions is what she fed to him. Rosemary Barton works for The National. This is supposed to be a hard-hitting journalist, well, not just a hard-hitting journalist industry, but a hard-hitting journalist show, The National. It's probably when it comes to CBC News, it's one of their top shows. And this is the sort of crap she comes out with. She's played defense for Trudeau, and we even can see how she, a few years ago, was criticizing Harper because he didn't have a balanced budget. He let several deficits run, and then just most recently she talks about how deficits don't seem to matter anymore underneath Justin Trudeau. Now, the one thing that's still unclear is whether she means that she was using that for herself, because she says, does deficit matters anymore? I don't think so. The question about that is whether she was speaking for herself and saying she doesn't think they matter anymore, or she meant that as a generalization and saying, do deficits matter anymore? And on a general note, they don't seem to matter anymore. That is the only thing about that interview that's unclear. That's the only thing about what she said is unclear. But if you ask me, her conduct in the interview, the one-on-one interview she did with Justin Trudeau, was ridiculous. But we return now to the Global Compact for Migration. The Global Compact is meant to take away the nation's immigration system. Because as we look to some documents, some articles that have come out from the UN, they've been talking about how many people are going to need to be resettled all across the world in the coming years. And they're talking huge numbers, something like 250 million. Something along those lines. But the thing is immigration is supposed to be not a right, but it's supposed to be a privilege that a country gives out to people to foreign nationals as long as they come into the country and they and they promise to abide by that country's culture and settle laws. But that has been rapidly changing over the world. These days, they're trying to solidify immigration as some sort of right, and this is what the Global Compact for Migration does. Now, they've been using all sort of buzzwords, those who are defending the Global Compact, saying it's non-binding. Well, nothing the UN is binding, technically. It's all non-binding, and even the Paris Climate Agreement is non-binding, but yet as we watch when it comes to climate change, when we watch someone like Catherine McKenna, she talks about over and over and over again about how we gotta meet our Paris Climate Agreement goals, or we're falling behind over here, we're falling behind over there, and we gotta meet those goals. And that just proves that it's not non-binding whatsoever. And a government like Justin Trudeau's government are going to solidify these global agreements into law, which means that the UN is literally dictating Canadian legislation. And this is why the UN is such a snaky, shady little piece of shit organization. The other thing is when you look at what the UN is made up of, it's made up of 192 nations, if I'm remembering correctly. About 190, give or take, nations that are involved in there. And in the General Assembly, every single nation has one vote, and that doesn't matter how big your population is. You could have a country of 60 people, or you could have a country of 2 billion people, and you still get one vote. Now, this can cause a problem because if you think about something like the Global Compact for Migration, when you look at it, this could be a very easy way for some nations to pass along their problems to more wealthy countries, such as what's going on with immigration. If we see a lot of, for instance, African countries where they're not very rich societies, they're having problems with clean water, they're having trouble with famine, well, then they could just pass those problems on to the Western world through the Global Compact for Migration by pretty much solidifying that immigration is the right of a nation, the right of the people of the world to immigrate to any nation they want. And any nation that signs on to it is pretty much stuck in this deal. It doesn't put restrictions on what type of people come here. So if we're talking about a country like Somalia that is violent, nothing is stopping from those people to coming to Canada. Nothing is stopping them from going to America. Well, America didn't sign the Global Compact for Migration. But this is why a lot of these leaders are now being considered traitors for signing on to it. There are people who are unhappy with Justin Trudeau for signing on to it, and even some members in the French military have stated that Emmanuel Macron is a traitor for doing this, for signing on to the Global Compact for Migration. And even recently, Macron and Merkel came out together to state that the countries that sign on to the Global Compact for Migration need to do their part, pretty much solidifying that it is in fact a binding contract. That you don't actually get a say anymore. The UN is dictating who gets to come to your country and in what numbers. One thing I think too is I believe Canada is being targeted in all this, not because of our society and our culture itself, but I think it's being used to undermine America. See, in a lot of ways, America is the last bastion of freedoms in this world. There is not a country that has the same freedom of the press, the same freedom of speech, the same freedom to defend yourself as America does. Every single other country has some restrictions when it comes to this. And America's not a perfect society. But I believe that between these freedoms, between the population number and the wealth that is available in America, I believe that this is posing a problem to an organization such as the UN. So when we have such a large mass migration of people that come to Canada, eventually we're going to see, for instance, like we take these jihadis that are in Canada right now. If they wanted to, and they wanted to organize and go into America and start causing chaos, they could do so. They could do so because their numbers are, even if they're pretty small in numbers. I can't remember exactly how many there are right now, but they have enough of them that they could cause chaos all over the U.S. if they're not expecting it. This is why we're seeing such large influxes of Muslim immigrants to Canada. Not necessarily that they're going to be jihadis and go down, but there is a plan to Islamize Canada. Put Canada under the control of Islam. Some people are starting to say out there that Justin Trudeau secretly has converted to Islam. He's not a Christian, he's not an atheist, he's a Muslim. And in fact, we've seen as Muslim leaders around the world have praised Justin Trudeau as being a friend to Islam. He has had no problem bringing over any Muslim that wants to, just like his father did. But why? There's a difference between being pro-immigration or pro-open borders and being pro one specific group of people. And this is what Justin Trudeau is. He is pro-Islam. He talks a lot about Islamophobia. He was helped, well, not him specifically, but we had Ikra Khalid who wrote Motion 103. And a motion is just a motion, as people say. But a motion also has other impacts on the grander scheme of politics. That there's something that can be made reference to. There's something that people can look back on when they're trying to draft legislation. And what I think ended up happening was that the motion was supposed to be the start of legislation in Canada, but the motion itself, just the motion, M103, received a lot of backlash from Canadians themselves, that Justin Trudeau and his government knew that if they tried to implement some legislation as some anti-Islamophobia legislation, that they would lose the Canadian people altogether. So I think this idea for Islamophobic legislation for some sort of hate speech against the Muslim people was actually put on the back burner because they realized that pushing it would have been a disaster for them. But as we look to where a lot of the Muslims are being settled, sure, they're getting settled in places like Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Quebec City, a lot of big cities. But Brampton has been one of it. Why Brampton? What does Brampton have to do with anything? Then you look around Brampton. What's around Brampton? I believe it is known as our Greenbelt. A lot of fertile land, some of the most fertile land in all of Canada. Some of the most fertile land in all of Canada. And for what reason is this? It's to gain control of the agriculture in Canada. Here we go. I gotta pull that. Oh, I still got this on. Hold on. There we go. We're back. Back to the classic. So here we go. All this area around here is the Greenbelt, some of those fertile land in all of Canada. And we can see that it takes, mostly it's where this is like the Toronto area around here, Brampton, and then we've also got down here is like Niagara sort of region. So what is the point of settling all these people in this area? Well, the reason for it is quite simple, and it has to do with actually, if you're Islamizing a country, if there's a plan in place to take over that country from a certain demographic of people, one of the best ways to do it would be to take over their food industry. Their agriculture, sorry, I should actually say, not the food industry, but to take over their agriculture. If you take over their agriculture, then you're in a lot of shit. And in ways, we see this in France, actually. Because one thing about what's going on in France is suddenly the meat industry has been taken over by a lot of Muslims in the halal industry. This was a documentary that was put out maybe about a year ago where it was showing this ended up happening. So what was going on is that people of France, if they wanted to get things such as chicken, 90% of the chicken was coming out of the halal industry, which is owned by Muslims. So then the locals were forced to go to these Muslim, these halal butchers to buy their meat. So the money goes into the Muslim community there, but the Muslim community had a tendency to buy from each other, which means the money was going into the industry and then the money was staying there. It was staying in the Muslim community, not getting put back out into the wider area of France. We will see something like this happen in our green belt. We will see this happen because that is a great way to take over that industry. You bring people in, you replace the local population there with the new demographics, and then when the demographics have changed enough, then the Muslims will start transforming the area for what they want. So this is part of a larger plot, and we may be too far gone here in Canada to forego it. And it's not like you can just import them all these people back to where they came from. Now, I don't want to say this is a plan sort of like everybody who comes here, all the Muslims who come here are aware of this. I don't believe that's the case, but I believe that this is the case of a lot of the leaders of these faiths, a lot of these imams. They're aware of what's going on, and I can't even tell you exactly who implements these, who is the mastermind behind this plan. I know that Justin Trudeau knows about it. That's no doubt. As we see the way he's been acting and who he's been importing, he's well aware of this plan and he's carrying it out. My only question is, who wrote this plan? Who's the mastermind behind it? Is it the Aga Khan, the leader of the Ismaili Muslims? I don't know. But it seems very clear to me that I'm not wrong. It seems very clear to me that there is a plan in place to Islamize Canada. And if we keep going down this way, it's going to happen. So prepare yourself, Canada. Arm yourselves. Although, with more gun legislation coming in, this is going to be a lot more difficult thing to do. I don't really know if I have anything else for you guys. Like I said, I didn't really come on here with a plan. I just decided to come on here and sort of vent a little bit, rant a little bit, riff a little bit. So I think I've said my piece for tonight. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you all for joining me today on the True North Report. I'll be back soon with more news that every Canadian needs to know.